Hi, guys. This is Mrs. Lamb, and today I am going to talk to you about early explorers and some of the navigational instruments that they used in order to explore. So, anyway, first of all, I want to go back and just briefly mention and talk about Marco Polo. You will want to remember about him that he was the explorer from Venice, Italy, and he went with his father and his uncle and traveled along the Silk Road all the way to the Mongol Empire, which is modern day China. And he had like this 24-year long journey that started when he was 17 years old. And then when he returned, he ended up being a part of a war between Venice and Genoa, which are two cities in Italy. And anyway, he gets captured by Genoa and thrown into jail. And while he's there, he tells his cellmate the story of all of his travels. And that actually gets written down and turned into a book. And the book ends up being called Travels, or sometimes it's referred to as The Travels of Marco Polo. So this image shows you the route that Marco Polo took. And again, he went to what we now know as China. And it was a 24-year long journey. Obviously, he stopped and stayed in some places for quite some time. The time period that exploration really took off was called the Renaissance. And the word Renaissance means rebirth or renewal. And basically, it was a renewed interest that people in Europe had in classical Greek and Roman learning. And one of the things that they were really interested in was exploring the unknown world. So we're going to skip, let's see. Yeah, right here. Spain, Portugal, England, and France started to look for new ways to increase their power and wealth for their countries. The two countries that really paved the way of exploration were Portugal and Spain. They really led the way. It's not until a little bit later that England, France, the Netherlands, that some of those guys start actually taking part. Now, one explorer that I haven't talked about yet, but I will talk about eventually, is an explorer that actually probably discovered North America about 500 years before Christopher Columbus, and that would be Leif Erikson. So that would have been around the year 1000. So we'll talk about that later. But technology's impact. Better maps and navigational instruments, such as the astrolabe and the compass, help navigators more accurately determine direction and location. So anyway, the astrolabe would tell you your latitude, approximate latitude on the earth, so that way you could at least have an idea where you were. And the compass obviously told you which direction was north. So then from that, you can figure out what the other directions were. Another important invention of the time period was a new type of ship called the caravel that enabled sailors to travel longer distances and further than they ever had before. The caravel had 3 masts. It's a 3-masted ship, and it also had the capability of sailing even when the winds weren't going the direction that you wanted to go. So this enabled sailors to explore new routes, especially they were looking for a sea route to Asia. They really wanted to get there to trade for silks and spices, things like that. Like I said before, Portugal and Spain really led the way. We're going to skip that part. Okay, so the Portuguese were the early leaders, and they actually started out trying to find out how far south the continent of Africa actually extended. But they were also really interested in getting gold from West Africa. West African coast is called the Gold Coast or the Ivory Coast because you could get gold or ivory there, and then also you could trade slaves there as well. Probably the father of the slave trade would have been Prince Henry of Portugal. He sponsored a bunch of expeditions to the west coast of Africa. He also set up a center for exploration so that scientists could share their knowledge with shipbuilders and sailors and plan voyages. So Prince Henry was the third son of the king and queen of Portugal at the time. So again, the west coast of Africa was called the Gold Coast, or it sometimes is called the Ivory Coast, and it's also where slaves were bought and sold. In 1487, Bartholomew Diaz explored the southernmost part of Africa, and this is where finally Portugal sees how far south Africa actually does extend, because up until that point it was unknown how far south it went. And so their goal was to find a route around Africa that Portugal wanted to use to get over to Asia, especially they wanted to get to India. This is just a statue of Diaz. So Diaz finds out how far south Africa extends. 10 years after that, in 1497, Vasco da Gama actually sails all the way around Africa. The southern tip of Africa is called the Cape of Good Hope. And da Gama actually does get all the way to India in 1498. All right, so you can see by this graphic here, the purple shows the voyages sponsored by Henry the Navigator between 1418 and 1460. Right here where my cursor is the west coast of Africa. This is the Gold Coast, or it's also known as the Ivory Coast. It's also where slaves were bought. Okay, the yellow color shows the route that Diaz took to find the southern tip of Africa. And then he turned back after he found it. And then 10 years later, da Gama, shown in green, he gets blown out a little bit further west in the Atlantic Ocean, but he does make his way all the way around the continent of Africa and goes to India. This is an important graphic to know and to remember. Okay, so I did allude to this a little bit before, but so before Columbus ever reached the Americas at all, there were the Vikings, who actually are credited now with reaching North America probably around the year 1000. Leif Erikson went from Greenland, at first the Vikings had established settlements in Iceland, then they had explored and found Greenland. Then from Greenland, Leif Erikson in specific, who was the son of Eric the Red, by the way, but he explored even west of Greenland and found what he called Vinland, because Vinland, for the vines of grapes, because there were a lot of grapes that naturally grew there. But this is probably what we now know as a part of Canada. Okay, so specifically Newfoundland or Newfoundland. Anyway, it's part of Canada today, but that is supposedly where Leif Erikson landed. There's some evidence of that because there's some old remains of what appears to be a Viking settlement that was discovered there. So it does seem like the story is probably true. And so the year 1000 is about 500 years before Columbus. So technically, Leif Erikson should be given the credit. Okay, so now on to Columbus. So Queen Isabella of Spain and King Ferdinand sponsored Columbus on his first voyage in August 1492. He set out with 3 ships to find a route to Asia. On October 12, 1492, he spotted land. He named it San Salvador and claimed it for Spain. He did not know where he had reached. He was convinced that he had actually made it all the way over into Asia, into what was known at the time as simply the Indies. Now we call them the East Indies. Columbus made 3 additional voyages, so 4 voyages total. His first voyage was 1492. Then there was one in 1493, 1498, and 1502. Throughout that time, he explored the Caribbean islands of Hispaniola, which is modern-day Haiti and Dominican Republic island, Cuba, Jamaica, and sailed along the coast of Central America, and even went into northern South America. And when he did, he claimed all these lands for Spain. But again, Columbus still thought he was in Asia. This graphic shows you Columbus's routes. So you can see each of the different times that Columbus went to what we now know as the New World. So, anyhow, the next thing that's important to know is that Spain and Portugal were kind of fighting it out for control over the newfound world, the new world, you know? And so there was this treaty called the Treaty of Tordesillas that Portugal and Spain signed that would clarify what was known as the line of demarcation. The line of demarcation marked a barrier between what was supposed to be controlled parts of the New World controlled by Portugal and what was supposed to be considered belonging to Spain. So at first, the line was a little bit more just in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and I'll show you on a graphic here in a second. But then it got moved further to the west because Portugal felt like they weren't given enough. So here's how it went. This line originally was where my cursor is, just basically in the middle, and Portugal had been given credit for all of the route that they had discovered around Africa to go to India. Spain had concentrated on going westward into what we now know as North and South America, and so they claimed all the lands to the west of the line. So the Treaty of Tordesillas moved the line from where it was, the line of demarcation, and moved it a little bit further to the west. Everything to the west of the line was considered property of Spain. Everything east of the line was considered property of Portugal. Now, no one really gave a second thought to the fact that there were Native Americans living there and that they probably would not appreciate the fact that their lands were being claimed by other countries. Amerigo Vespucci, which is what America is actually named after, he was a map maker, which is a cartographer, and he mapped the South America's coastline, and that's why it was named after him. Vasco Núñez de Balboa claimed the Pacific Ocean and adjoining lands for Spain. Ferdinand Magellan is credited as the first person, even though he didn't make it, but his crew made it all the way around the world. So he circumnavigated the world.